Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I spent 15 years maintaining the grounds at Riverside National Cemetery, about 40 miles outside of Denver. It was steady work, quiet most days. Just me and my crew keeping the grass trimmed and the headstones clean. The place held over 12,000 veterans, rows and rows of white marble stretching across 90 acres. I'd gotten to know certain sections like the back of my hand, especially Section K where they buried the guys from Iraq and Afghanistan. Families would come every weekend, leaving flowers and little American flags, sometimes photos wrapped in plastic to protect them from the rain. I took pride in keeping everything respectful, making sure the place looked dignified for when people came to visit their loved ones. The whole thing started in early October, right when the leaves were turning that burnt orange color. A woman named Janet Brennan had come to visit her son's grave like she did every Sunday, bringing fresh white carnations from the grocery store. Her boy, Private First Class Michael Brennan, had been killed in Helmand Province back in 2012. She always stayed for exactly an hour, sitting on one of those portable camping chairs she'd bring, just talking to the headstone like he was sitting right there with her. But that particular Sunday, she came running to the maintenance shed where I was cleaning equipment, practically screaming that someone had destroyed her flowers. When I followed her back to Section K, I saw what she meant. The carnations looked like they'd been put through a paper shredder, white petals scattered everywhere, stems twisted and mangled beyond recognition. At first, I figured it had to be kids messing around, maybe some teenagers with nothing better to do on a weekend. I helped Janet clean up the mess and told her I'd keep an extra eye on things. But then it happened again the following week, this time to a family who'd left yellow roses on their son's grave 3 rows over. The Andersons had driven 6 hours from Nebraska to visit Corporal Jake Anderson's resting place, and they found their flowers absolutely demolished, petals ground into the grass like someone had stomped on them with boots. The weird part was that other flowers on nearby graves were completely untouched. A bouquet of red tulips literally 2 feet away sat there perfect as could be. I started documenting everything in my work log, taking photos with my phone because my supervisor, Tom Garrett, wanted evidence if we were dealing with vandalism. By the 3rd week, word had spread among the families who visited regularly, and people were getting angry. We installed 2 motion-activated cameras near Section K, the kind hunters use to track deer, figuring we'd catch whoever was doing this. The footage showed absolutely nothing, just the flowers sitting there one frame, and then maybe 20 minutes later, completely shredded with no one in sight. Not even wind could explain it because the destruction was too deliberate, too violent. The petals weren't just scattered, they were torn into tiny, almost uniform pieces. Tom called the police, but they basically shrugged and said without evidence of an actual person doing it, there wasn't much they could investigate. Meanwhile, I started noticing a pattern that made my chest tighten every time I thought about it. Every single grave where flowers got destroyed belonged to a soldier who died from friendly fire. I only realized this because I'd been cross-referencing my incident reports with the cemetery's database, trying to find some connection between the affected graves. Michael Brennan, killed when a convoy mistook his patrol for insurgents. Jake Anderson, died from a misidentified drone strike on his position. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The cemetery had maybe 30 or 40 friendly fire casualties, scattered throughout different sections, and every destroyed bouquet sat on one of those specific graves. I didn't tell anyone about this discovery right away because, honestly, it sounded insane even in my own head. How could anyone know which deaths were friendly fire just by looking at the headstones? The markers didn't specify cause of death, just name, rank, and dates. I decided to test my theory on a Monday morning when the cemetery was basically empty, except for me and 2 other groundskeepers working the far sections. I bought a small bunch of daisies from the supermarket and placed them on Staff Sergeant Anthony Russo's grave, another friendly fire casualty from 2009. Then I sat in my truck about 50 yards away, drinking coffee from my thermos and pretending to fill out paperwork while keeping my eyes on those daisies. After about 45 minutes, I got out to check the sprinkler system in the next section over, but I made sure to keep glancing back at Russo's headstone every few minutes. When I walked back an hour later, the daisies were obliterated, white and yellow fragments spread across the grass like confetti. The graves on either side still had their artificial wreaths sitting exactly where families had placed them weeks ago. The situation escalated when Glenn Foster showed up that Wednesday. Glenn was Michael Brennan's squad leader, the one who'd called in the coordinates that led to the friendly fire incident. I recognized him from the memorial service years ago, a stocky guy with prematurely gray hair and this permanent furrow between his eyebrows. He came carrying an expensive arrangement, must have cost him $200 easy, with purple irises and white lilies arranged in a brass vase. He knelt at Brennan's grave for maybe 10 minutes, not saying anything, just staring at the headstone with his jaw clenched tight. After he left, I watched from the equipment shed as usual. This time, the destruction happened faster. Within 15 minutes, those expensive flowers were torn apart so viciously that pieces of purple petals had somehow ended up 20 feet away, stuck to other headstones like someone had thrown them with force. I finally told Tom about the pattern that Friday, showing him my documentation and the list of friendly fire casualties I'd compiled. He went pale when I laid it all out, kept running his hand through what was left of his hair and muttering about how this couldn't be happening. We decided to contact the families privately, starting with Janet Brennan since she'd been dealing with this the longest. When I called her that evening from the cemetery office, she was quiet for a long time after I explained what I'd discovered. Then she told me something that made me sit down hard in my desk chair. She said Michael had been sending her emails for 3 weeks before he died, talking about how angry the Afghan soldiers were about a mistaken attack on their outpost the month before, how tensions were so bad that nobody trusted anybody anymore. The last email, sent 2 days before he died, just said, "Mom, I'm more scared of our own guys than the Taliban." That weekend, something different happened. A retired colonel named Walter Hoffman came to visit several graves in Section K. He'd been the commanding officer for a unit that lost 3 soldiers to friendly fire in a single incident back in 2011. He brought 3 identical bouquets of red poppies, one for each grave, and spent about 5 minutes at each one, saluting before moving to the next. I watched him from a distance, pretending to rake leaves nearby. About 10 minutes after he'd gone, I walked over to check on the flowers. 2 of the bouquets were already destroyed, red petals looking like drops of blood against the green grass. But the third one, on Private David Yuan's grave, was still intact. I stood there staring at it, waiting for something to happen, when I noticed the groundskeeper's note in our database. Yuan's family had requested his body be exhumed and moved to a private cemetery in California just 2 months ago. The grave was empty. Tom and I spent that entire Sunday in his office, going through military records we probably shouldn't have had access to, courtesy of Tom's brother who worked at the Defense Department. We found something that turned our stomachs. In every single friendly fire case where flowers were being destroyed, the investigation had been closed without anyone being held accountable. Administrative errors, fog of war, equipment malfunctions. Always an excuse, never any real consequences. But there were other friendly fire graves in the cemetery, where flowers remained untouched, and in those cases someone had actually been court-martialed or formally disciplined. I kept thinking about those shredded flowers, how violent the destruction was, how it only happened to the flowers on graves where justice had never been served. Tom suggested we bring in a priest, maybe have the grounds blessed or something, but I knew that wasn't the answer. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't about religion. The breaking point came the next morning when I arrived at work to find Glenn Foster's truck parked by Section K again. He was standing at Brennan's grave with another bouquet, but also with something else, a bottle of whiskey and what looked like a handgun in his waistband. I called Tom immediately and approached Glenn carefully, keeping my voice calm and steady. He was drunk, swaying slightly, tears streaming down his weathered face. He kept saying he was sorry, over and over, that the coordinates had been wrong, that the visibility was bad, that he'd tried to abort the strike but the radio had cut out. He placed the new flowers down gently, then pulled out the gun. I thought he was going to shoot himself right there, but instead, he aimed it at the headstone and started screaming at Michael to forgive him, to stop destroying the flowers, to let him make peace. The flowers exploded into pieces right in front of us while Glenn was still yelling, petals flying up into his face like they were being thrown at him. He dropped the gun and fell to his knees, sobbing into his hands while white carnation petals continued swirling around him in the still morning air. After the police took Glenn away for psychiatric evaluation, and Tom filed his report with the cemetery administration, we made a quiet decision. We stopped replacing the flowers on those specific graves. Instead, we suggested families plant small American flags or leave coins, military challenge coins especially, which seemed to remain untouched. Most families adapted, though Janet Brennan still brings flowers every Sunday. She just doesn't leave them anymore. She holds them while she talks to Michael, then takes them home with her. The destroyed flower incident stopped completely after about 2 weeks. I still work at Riverside, still maintain Section K, but now I understand something I wish I didn't. Some things don't rest easy, especially when justice never came. Those boys died twice, once by enemy fire they never saw coming, and once by friendly fire that never got answered for. Maybe the flowers were just caught in between those two deaths, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist but does, in that space where accountability should have been but never was. Most people think cemetery work is creepy, but honestly, after 6 months as a night watchman at Hillcrest Memorial, I'd gotten used to the quiet. It was March of 2022, and I was pulling my usual shift from midnight to 8 in the morning. The job paid decent, and being 43 with a bad knee from construction work, I wasn't exactly drowning in options. My wife Karen and I had just bought our first house, a little ranch-style place about 10 minutes from the cemetery, and the steady paycheck meant everything to us. The cemetery itself wasn't huge, maybe 15 acres total, with sections dating back to the 1890s. Most nights I'd do my rounds every 2 hours, checking the gates, making sure no teenagers were drinking beer behind the mausoleums, that sort of thing. Pretty standard security stuff, nothing that would make your hair stand on end. The first time I heard the laughter was a Wednesday night around 2:30 a.m. I was sitting in the small security office near the main entrance, eating a ham sandwich and watching some old sitcom on my phone when this sound drifted through the window. Kids giggling, the way they do when they're playing tag or hide and seek. Clear as day, maybe 4 or 5 different voices. Couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old from the sound of it. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, figuring some local kids had snuck in for a dare or something. The sound was coming from the newer section, over by the oak trees on the west side. But here's the thing. The closer I got, the more the laughter seemed to move around like the kids were circling me, staying just out of sight behind the headstones. Then, just like someone hit a switch, complete silence. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. When I swept my flashlight across the area, all I found was disturbed gravel around a cluster of 6 graves, like someone had been kicking at the stones. And get this, there were candy wrappers scattered on top of the headstones. Not old, weathered ones either. Fresh Snickers and Milky Way wrappers, the chocolate smell still hanging in the air. The graves were all grouped together, and when I looked closer, the dates hit me hard. Every single one of these kids had died on the same day, November 14th, 2014. The oldest was 11, the youngest was 7. I picked up one of the wrappers, and it was damp with dew, meaning someone had just left it there within the hour. But there was no way out of that section except past where I'd come from, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone leave. The main gate was locked, the fence was intact, and there were no footprints in the grass except mine. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. What was I going to say? That I heard ghost kids playing in the cemetery? My supervisor, Robert, was a no-nonsense guy in his 60s who'd probably fire me for drinking on the job if I came to him with that story. So I kept my mouth shut and just made a note in the log about finding litter that I'd cleaned up. But 2 nights later, it happened again. Same time, almost to the minute, 2:30 a.m. This time, the laughter was louder, more distinct. I could hear individual voices. One kid doing that shrieking laugh when someone's chasing them, another one calling out something I couldn't quite make out. It sounded so real, so normal, like any group of kids at recess. I practically ran to that section, determined to catch whoever was messing around. This time I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The gravel around those 6 graves wasn't just disturbed, it was arranged in patterns. Little paths weaving between the headstones exactly like kids make when they're playing some kind of game. And the candy wrappers? They were placed deliberately on each grave, 1 piece per kid, all different kinds. Reese's, Kit Kat, Butterfinger, M&M's, Twix, and a Hershey bar. The kind of haul kids get from trick-or-treating. But here's what really got me. There were fresh handprints on the headstones. Small ones, child-sized, visible in the dew that had settled on the granite. I touched one of them, and my finger came away wet. These weren't old marks. Someone, or several someones, had just been here, pressing their palms against the cold stone like they were playing some kind of game. I started doing research on my phone during my breaks. Didn't take long to find the news articles from 2014. School bus accident on Highway 49, coming back from a field trip to a science museum. The bus driver had suffered a heart attack, and the bus went off an embankment. 6 kids from Riverside Elementary didn't make it. The articles had their school photos, bright smiling faces in their best picture day clothes. One girl, Melissa, was holding a certificate for winning the school spelling bee. A boy named Christopher was wearing a baseball uniform, just regular kids, the kind you'd see at any school, anywhere. The articles mentioned that the surviving kids from the bus said they'd been sharing their museum gift shop candy on the ride home, passing bags back and forth, everyone trading their favorites. That detail made me set my phone down and just stare at those graves for a long time. The following Friday night, I decided to wait near those graves before 2:30 a.m. I positioned myself behind a large memorial about 30 feet away, where I could see everything clearly but stay hidden. At 2:15, the cemetery was dead quiet, just the usual sounds of wind through trees and distant traffic on the highway. At 2:25, I noticed something odd. The temperature dropped, not dramatically, but enough that I could see my breath. Then at exactly 2:30, the sounds started again. But this time, being closer and completely still, I could make out actual words. "You're it," one voice shouted. "No tag backs," called another. The sound of feet running on gravel, so clear I could track the movement from grave to grave. And then, I saw the impossible. The candy wrappers on the headstones were moving, lifting slightly as if touched by invisible fingers, crinkling in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. I'll be honest with you. Every rational part of my brain was scrambling for an explanation. Maybe there was some kind of acoustical phenomenon, sounds carrying from somewhere else. Maybe local kids were playing an elaborate prank with fishing line or something. But then I heard one voice, clearer than the others, a little girl's voice that said, "Mr. Bryan, is that you hiding there?" My blood turned to ice water. Nobody knew my name at the cemetery except Robert and the day shift guy. I hadn't introduced myself to anyone else, hadn't worn a name tag, nothing. The voice came again, patient and sweet. "We know you've been watching us. We just want to play. We get so bored." And then another voice, a boy this time. "We brought candy to share, just like on the bus. Don't you want some?" The wrapper on Melissa's grave, the one whose photo I'd seen with the spelling bee certificate, crinkled again, louder this time, insistent. I stood up slowly, my knees cracking from crouching too long, and walked toward the graves. Don't ask me why. Maybe it was the security guard in me. Maybe I just needed to know what was really happening. The moment I stepped into their circle of graves, the laughter stopped, but I could still hear breathing. Multiple sets of small lungs pulling in air, releasing it in little puffs I could see in the cold. "We miss Candy," said a young boy's voice right next to my ear. "Mrs. Patterson always let us trade at lunch, but we can't anymore." I looked down and saw fresh footprints in the gravel, small sneaker prints that weren't there 5 seconds ago. Size 3, maybe size 4, kid-sized. They led from grave to grave in a pattern that made perfect sense if you were playing tag, the kind where you have to run to base, touch it, and run back. That's when I noticed the dates on the candy wrappers. I picked up the Snickers wrapper from Christopher's headstone, and my flashlight caught the expiration date printed on the edge, 12/2014. The candy bar that had supposedly just been eaten was from 8 years ago, but the wrapper felt new, crisp, like it had just come off the bar. The chocolate smell was fresh. I checked another wrapper, the Kit Kat. Same thing, late 2014. These weren't old wrappers that had been saved. They were somehow both old and new at the same time. I heard footsteps behind me, that distinct sound of kids' sneakers on gravel. And when I turned around, there were 6 sets of fresh handprints on the ground, pressed into the gravel like someone had been doing handstands. Small fingers, clearly defined. I knelt down and put my hand next to one. It was barely half the size of mine. When I stood back up, I found a piece of notebook paper tucked under a rock on Melissa's grave. School ruled, 3 holes punched on the side, the kind kids use. Written in pencil in careful elementary school cursive, "We just want friends to play with. M." The next morning, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I drove to Riverside Elementary and asked to speak with Mrs. Patterson. The secretary told me she'd retired in 2016, but gave me an address where I might find her. Patricia Patterson lived in a small blue house with a garden full of sunflowers. When I explained who I was and asked about the bus accident, her eyes immediately filled with tears. "Those were my kids," she said, inviting me in for coffee. 3rd and 4th graders, sweet as could be. She showed me a photo from their Halloween party, just 2 weeks before the accident. All 6 of them dressed as superheroes and princesses, holding pillowcases full of candy. They loved trading candy more than eating it, she said. Every day after lunch, they'd sit in a circle and negotiate trades like little business people. Melissa kept a notebook listing everyone's favorites. She pulled out a small composition notebook from a memory box. There it was, the same handwriting I'd seen on that note, listing things like "Christopher loves Snickers" and "Madison only trades for chocolate." I told Mrs. Patterson about what I'd been experiencing at the cemetery. Expected her to think I was crazy, but instead she just nodded slowly. "Other people have mentioned things," she said quietly. "Parents who visit. They find candy on the graves, even when they didn't bring any. Toys moved around. Once Madison's mother found her daughter's favorite hairband on the headstone, the purple one with butterflies she was wearing when she couldn't finish. The first year after the accident, some of the surviving kids from the bus would sneak out at night. Their parents would find them at the cemetery, sitting in a circle around those graves, sharing candy and talking like their friends were still there. They said they could hear them, that they were still playing together. The parents got scared, started locking windows, getting therapy for the kids. Eventually it stopped. But maybe it never really stopped. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much grief. Maybe they're still waiting for their friends to come back and play. That night, I made a decision. I went to the grocery store before my shift and bought 6 different candy bars, the exact ones I'd been finding on the graves. At 2:15 a.m., I walked to that cluster of headstones and placed 1 candy bar on each grave, matching them to what Mrs. Patterson's notebook had shown were their favorites. Then I sat down in the middle of their circle, right there on the cold gravel, and waited. At 2:30, the sounds started again, but gentler this time. No running or laughing, just soft footsteps circling around me. I felt something brush against my shoulder, light as a feather. The candy bars I'd placed began to rustle, and when I looked, each wrapper was opened, but not torn, peeled back carefully the way kids do when their parents tell them to save the wrapper. The chocolate inside was gone, disappeared completely, leaving only empty wrappers that still smelled fresh. I started talking to them, told them about my day, about my wife's terrible cooking, about the stray cat that lived behind the maintenance shed. And I swear I heard giggles, soft and warm. After about an hour, I stood up to leave and found 6 small objects placed in a neat row where I'd been sitting. A purple butterfly hairband, a tiny baseball card, Christopher's photo from his Little League team, a pencil with bite marks on it, a friendship bracelet made of embroidery floss, a small plastic dinosaur, and a folded piece of notebook paper with a gold star sticker on it, the kind teachers give out. I picked them up carefully, understanding what they were. These kids had traded with me. They'd given me their treasures in exchange for the candy. When I got home that morning, I put those items in a shoebox and placed it on the shelf in my closet. I still have them. After that night, things changed. The sounds continued every few nights, always at 2:30 a.m., but I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd bring candy bars, leave them on the graves, and sit there for a while. Sometimes I'd hear them playing, sometimes just whispers, and sometimes nothing at all, but the candy would always disappear. Other guards started working that shift after I got promoted to day supervisor 6 months later, and 2 of them quit within the first week. Said the cemetery was haunted, that they heard kids laughing in the dark. Robert asked me about it once, and I just shrugged and told him some nights the wind carries sounds from the residential area nearby. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it either. The guard who finally stuck around, a young guy named Kevin, came to me after his first month. "The kids in Section C," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Should I do anything about them?" I handed him a grocery bag with 6 candy bars inside. "Leave these on the graves when you hear them," I told him. "They just want someone to remember they were kids." He nodded and never brought it up again. I still visit sometimes during the day now. Families have started leaving candy on those graves regularly. Word spreads in small towns, even the unspoken things. Especially around Halloween, you'll find the headstones covered in treats. The parents of the surviving kids from the bus sometimes come together, and I've seen them sitting in a circle right there on the ground, sharing stories about all the children, not just the ones who made it home. Last November 14th, on the anniversary, I found Mrs. Patterson there with a grocery bag full of candy bars, placing them carefully on each grave. "They were good kids," she said when she saw me. Still are, I suppose. We stood there together for a while, 2 people who'd learned that some things don't need explaining, just accepting. The cemetery doesn't feel haunted to me. Feels like a playground where 6 kids are still trading candy, still calling tag, still being what they'll always be. Children who never got the chance to grow up, but never really left either. I work nights at Willowbrook Cemetery, just outside of town. Started the job about 8 months ago, after my construction company went under, and I needed something steady to pay the bills. The job posting said night security and maintenance, but really I just drive around in a golf cart, check that the gates are locked, and make sure the new motion sensor lights they installed last year are working properly. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and honestly, most nights I just sit in the little office near the main entrance, watching Netflix on my phone and doing my rounds every couple hours. The cemetery installed those LED motion lights along all the main paths after some vandalism incidents. They're supposed to help me spot anyone who shouldn't be there after dark. Each section has its own grid of sensors, and there's a monitor in the office that shows me which zones light up when something moves through them. Tuesday nights have become a problem. Every single Tuesday, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the lights in Section G start going off in sequence. First the one by the maintenance shed, then the next one about 30 feet down the path, then the next, and the next, like someone's walking that specific route at a steady pace. The path leads straight through the older part of the cemetery, past headstones from the 1960s and 70s, and ends at a modest granite marker near the back fence. I noticed the pattern after my third week on the job, and at first I figured it was just an animal. We get deer sometimes, raccoons all the time, but animals don't walk in perfect straight lines, and they definitely don't keep to the exact same schedule every week. The really strange part is what I see on the security cameras. Absolutely nothing. The lights illuminate empty paths, casting shadows from headstones and trees, but there's never anyone there. After about 2 months of this, I started keeping a log. Tuesday, 2:47 a.m., Section G lights activate in sequence duration, approximately 3 minutes and 15 seconds. Same path every time, same walking speed, never varies by more than a few seconds. I tried everything to figure it out. Checked for underground pipes that might be releasing steam, looked for sprinkler systems on timers, even stayed out there one Tuesday night hiding behind a large monument to see it with my own eyes. When 2:47 hit, the lights started their sequence right on schedule. I watched each one flick on, bright white LED flooding the path, and I swear to you there was nothing there. Just the lights responding to something I couldn't see, traveling that same route like clockwork. The motion sensors are infrared. They detect heat signatures and movement, and they're sensitive enough to pick up a rabbit from 20 feet away. Whatever was triggering them was giving off enough heat and mass to register, but remained completely invisible to both my eyes and our cameras. I started digging into the cemetery records during my downtime, trying to figure out if there was something special about that particular path, or where it ended. Most of the graves in Section G are from families who lived in town during the 60s and 70s, teachers, shop owners, regular folks. The path that lights up every Tuesday night ends at the grave of a woman named Dorothy Caldwell, died in 1973 at age 29. Her headstone is simple, just her name and dates plus the words beloved daughter and sister. Nothing unusual about it, except that it's exactly where the light sequence stops every single time. I found her obituary in the cemetery's old files, just a brief mention that she died unexpectedly, survived by her parents and 2 brothers. But something nagged at me about the timing, about why it was always Tuesday nights, always at that exact minute. Last week I went to the town library on my day off. The librarian, an older woman named Grace who's worked there since the 80s, helped me look through the newspaper archives from 1973. We found the article about Dorothy Caldwell's death, and when I read it, everything clicked into place in the worst possible way. Dorothy had been walking home from her job at the town's old textile mill on a Tuesday night in November. She always took the same route, down Mill Road, past where the cemetery's back entrance is now, then along what used to be called Carpenter's Lane. She was struck by a drunk driver at 2:47 a.m., died on impact. The paper said she'd walked that route every Tuesday night for 3 years, always got off her shift at 2:30, always passed that spot at the same time. The driver was never caught. They found her body the next morning, her lunch pail scattered in the ditch, her coat torn where she'd been dragged several feet by the impact. Here's where it gets worse. The path those lights trace through Section G? When I compared it to the old town maps at the library, that path follows the exact route of the old Carpenter's Lane, before they moved it in 1975 to expand the cemetery. The maintenance shed sits right where Mill Road used to intersect with it. Every Tuesday night at 2:47 a.m., those motion sensors are detecting something walking Dorothy Caldwell's route home, the same route she walked for 3 years, the same route where she died, now incorporated into the cemetery where she's buried. I showed my findings to my supervisor, Carl, thinking maybe we could adjust the sensors or something, but he just shrugged and told me not to worry about it. Said the sensors probably had a glitch, maybe picking up temperature changes from the ground or something. But temperature changes don't walk in straight lines at exactly human walking speed, and they sure don't stick to a schedule that matches a death from 50 years ago. Tonight is Tuesday again, and I'm sitting here in the office watching the clock tick toward 2:47. I've tried to rationalize it 100 different ways. Maybe there's some kind of electrical interference on a timer. Maybe the old mill had machinery that still affects the area somehow. Maybe it's just the mother of all coincidences. but I've worked here long enough now to notice other things too. The temperature drops in Section G around 2:45 every Tuesday, even in the middle of summer. My equipment starts acting up. The radio gets static, my phone loses signal, the golf cart's battery meter fluctuates even though I just charged it. And there's this weight in the air, like the pressure change before a storm, except the weather's always clear on Tuesday nights. Always. I checked the weather records going back 6 months, and there hasn't been a single Tuesday night with rain or storms during my shift. It's like something needs those conditions to be just right. I've started researching Dorothy's life, trying to understand why this keeps happening. Found out she was engaged to a man named Harold Fisher, who moved away after she died. Her brothers are both gone now, passed away in the 90s and 2000s. But I tracked down her nephew, lives about 2 hours away, and he told me something that made everything even stranger. Dorothy was always punctual, he said. Never missed a day of work, never varied her routine. But on the night she died, she'd actually left work 15 minutes early because she wasn't feeling well. If she'd left at her normal time, that drunk driver would have been long gone. The nephew also mentioned that his father, Dorothy's younger brother, used to swear he'd see her sometimes, walking past his house on Tuesday nights, even though his house was nowhere near the cemetery. He said his father eventually moved because of it. Couldn't stand living on what used to be her route home. 2 weeks ago, I decided to follow the lights when they activated. I positioned myself at Dorothy's grave at 2:45 a.m. waiting. Right on schedule, I saw the first light flick on by the maintenance shed, that harsh LED white cutting through the darkness. Then the next one, 30 feet closer, then the next. I walked backward, keeping pace with whatever was triggering them, staying just ahead of each activation. The air got colder with each step, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me even though it was early September. When the sequence reached the grave, the final light bathed Dorothy's headstone in that stark brightness, and I noticed something I'd never seen before. Fresh flowers at the base of the stone. Not cemetery flowers, not the artificial ones families sometimes leave, but wildflowers, the kind that grow along roadsides, the kind Dorothy might have picked walking home from work. I asked Carl about them the next day, but he said the grounds crew hadn't placed any flowers there, and Dorothy had no living relatives in town who visited regularly. The worst part happened last Tuesday. I'd brought a thermal camera from home, borrowed it from my brother who uses it for home inspections. At 2:47 a.m. I watched through the viewfinder as the first sensor triggered. The thermal showed nothing at first, just the cold blue of the path and the slightly warmer headstones that had absorbed heat during the day. But as each light activated, I saw it. A shape in the thermal image, human-sized but barely there, like an echo of heat rather than a source. It moved at a steady pace, that familiar walking speed I'd tracked so many times. The shape wasn't solid, more like a disturbance in the air temperature, a subtle gradient between the ambient cold and something slightly warmer. When it reached Dorothy's grave, it stopped, and for just a moment, the thermal image intensified, showing what looked like a person standing there, facing the headstone. Then it faded, dissipating like breath on a cold morning, and the lights went dark. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, so I did something that might have been stupid. I went back to the library and dug deeper into the accident reports from 1973. The drunk driver was never caught, but there were witness statements from people who heard the impact, saw the headlights speeding away. One witness, a man who lived near the accident site, said he'd been suffering from insomnia and was awake that night. He reported seeing Dorothy walking, then hearing the terrible sound of the collision, then seeing a dark-colored sedan speed past his house. But here's what nobody seemed to notice in the old reports. That witness, Eugene Watts, had been the night security guard at the textile mill. He would have known exactly when Dorothy left, would have known her route, would have known she walked alone. The police never questioned why he was awake at that exact time, looking out his window at that exact spot. Eugene Watts died in 1991, took whatever he might have known with him. His grave is in Section B of this same cemetery, and sometimes when I'm doing my rounds, I notice his section's lights flicker too, but never in a pattern, never with purpose. Just random, erratic, like something disturbed. I made a decision last night. I submitted my 2 weeks' notice to Carl, told him I found a day job at a warehouse across town. He didn't seem surprised, said a lot of night security guards don't last long at Willowbrook, though he wouldn't elaborate on why. My last shift is this Friday, and I'm counting down the days, but I did one more thing before I decided to leave. I placed a small plaque next to Dorothy's grave. Nothing official, just something I had made at the trophy shop downtown. It reads, "Your journey home continues. May you find peace at its end." When I placed it there yesterday afternoon, the air felt different, lighter somehow. Tonight, Tuesday again, it's 2:46 a.m. as I write this. In 1 minute, those lights will start their sequence. But something feels different. The temperature hasn't dropped, my equipment is working fine, and there's no pressure in the air. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but I want to believe that acknowledgement matters, that sometimes things just need to be seen and understood. The clock just hit 2:47. The lights in Section G remain dark. For the first time in 8 months, Tuesday night at Willowbrook Cemetery is quiet, and Dorothy Caldwell's path home has finally ended. The rain started around 4 that afternoon, right when I was finishing up the maintenance on the east side of Oakwood Cemetery. I'd been working there for about 6 years at that point, mostly doing groundskeeping and closing up the gates every evening. It was a decent job, quiet most of the time, and I actually liked the solitude. My wife Amy always joked that I preferred the company of the dead to the living, and honestly, after dealing with my previous job in retail, she wasn't entirely wrong. That particular day in late September, I was alone since my coworker Brad had called in sick. The cemetery sprawled across 40 acres, and with the storm getting worse by the minute, I wanted to finish my rounds quickly and head home before the roads flooded. I was heading toward the main gates around 6:30 when I spotted someone near the older section of graves. Through the sheets of rain, I could make out a figure moving slowly between the headstones, stopping occasionally like they were reading the inscriptions. Now, we technically closed at 6, but it wasn't unusual for people to lose track of time when visiting loved ones. The guy was wearing what looked like a dark coat, completely soaked through, and he didn't have an umbrella. Something about the way he moved seemed deliberate, methodical even, like he was searching for a specific grave. I grabbed my flashlight from the maintenance shed and started walking toward him, pulling my hood up against the downpour. The mud was already ankle-deep in some spots, and I had to watch my step to avoid slipping on the wet grass. As I got closer, I called out to him, trying to be polite but firm. "Sir, we're closed for the evening. I need to lock up." The man didn't turn around immediately. He just stood there, facing a weathered headstone from the 1950s, rain streaming down his back. When he finally did turn, I noticed he was probably in his 40s, clean-shaven, with this peculiar scar running from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone. His clothes weren't just wet, they were completely drenched, like he'd been standing in the rain for hours. He looked at me with these pale gray eyes and said, "I know, but I needed to wait until you finished with the Henderson plot." That stopped me cold because I had just been working on the Henderson family section, trimming the hedges and replacing some flowers. Nobody else had been around to see me there. Before I could ask how he knew that, he continued talking in this calm, measured voice. "You always do the Hendersons on Mondays when Brad's here, but since he's sick today, you had to squeeze it in before closing." The rain was hammering down harder now, and I had to wipe water from my eyes to keep looking at him. This stranger knew my coworker's name, knew our work schedule. I tried to stay professional, told him visitor information was private, and he really needed to leave. But he just tilted his head slightly and said, "Amy's making lasagna tonight, isn't she? She always does on Mondays when you work late." The words hit me like ice water. How could he possibly know my wife's name, let alone what she was cooking for dinner? I took a step back, my boots squelching in the mud, and gripped my flashlight tighter. The rational part of my brain was trying to find explanations. Maybe he knew someone from town. Maybe he'd overheard conversations, Maybe he worked somewhere I'd been. But none of that explained the level of detail he had. "Who are you?" I asked, hearing the edge in my own voice. He didn't answer right away, just started walking slowly between the graves, running his fingers along the tops of the headstones as he passed them. "You're going to stop at the gas station on Elm Street on your way home," he said, still not looking at me. "You'll buy a scratch-off ticket, the $5 crossword one, and you'll win $20. You always buy one when Brad's out sick because you feel lucky about the overtime pay." The accuracy was terrifying. I did always stop at that specific gas station, and yes, I had a stupid superstition about buying scratch-offs when I got overtime hours. But I'd never told anyone about that habit, not even Amy. The rain was soaking through my jacket now, but I barely noticed. I pulled out my phone, thinking maybe I should call the police, but the man noticed and shook his head. "Your phone's at 12% battery," he said quietly. "You forgot to charge it last night because you were watching that documentary about serial killers until 2 in the morning. Amy fell asleep on the couch at 11:15. I looked at my phone screen. 11% battery, close enough to make my chest tighten. And yes, I had stayed up watching exactly that, and Amy had dozed off on the couch around 11. The man finally stopped walking and turned to face me fully. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and water was dripping steadily from his chin. "You keep a photo in your wallet," he said, taking a step closer. "Not of Amy. The other one, behind your driver's license. The girl from college, Rebecca. You dated her for 3 years before you met Amy. You never told your wife you still carry it." My hand instinctively went to my back pocket where my wallet was. Nobody knew about that photo. It was just a small thing, a memory I couldn't quite let go of, hidden behind everything else. Rebecca had died in a car accident 2 years after we broke up, and I'd kept her picture as a sort of memorial. It wasn't romantic anymore, just something I couldn't throw away. But I'd never mentioned it to anyone, ever. "You need to leave. Now," I said, but my voice came out weaker than I intended. The man just stood there, rain pooling around his feet in the saturated ground. "Your mother calls every Sunday at exactly 7:30, he continued as if I hadn't spoken. "But you let it go to voicemail half the time because she always asks when you and Amy are going to have kids, and you don't want to tell her about the fertility treatments that aren't working." That one hit hard. We'd been trying for 2 years, spent thousands on treatments, and hadn't told our families yet. The disappointment was too raw, too private. I started backing away toward the maintenance shed, thinking I could lock myself in and call 911 from the landline there. But the man called after me. "The shed door sticks. You have to lift and pull at the same time. You've been meaning to fix it for 4 months." I ran. I didn't care about dignity or protocol anymore. I just ran through the rain and mud toward my truck parked by the main entrance. Behind me, I could hear the man's voice, steady and unhurried. "You're going to slip near the Morrison Monument. There's a route there you always forget about." Sure enough, my foot caught on something and I went down hard, my knee slamming into a gravestone. Pain shot up my leg, but I scrambled back up, limping now, covered in mud and grass. When I glanced back, the man was following but not running. Just walking at that same measured pace, like he knew exactly where I was going and how long it would take me to get there. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely get my keys out of my pocket. I finally reached my truck and yanked the door open, slamming it shut and hitting the locks immediately. Through the rain-blurred windshield, I could see him standing about 20 feet away, just watching. I started the engine, and that's when he did something that made my whole body go rigid. He held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. Right as his last finger went down, my engine sputtered and died. I turned the key again. Nothing. The man walked closer, stopping right by my driver's side window. "Alternator," he said, loud enough for me to hear through the glass. "It's been making that whining sound for 3 weeks. You were planning to get it fixed this weekend." He was right. The truck had been making that sound, and I had an appointment at the shop for Saturday. The man pressed his palm flat against my window, and I could see every line in his hand through the rain-streaked glass. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. and for some reason I believed him. There was something in his tone, almost sad, like he was carrying out some obligation he didn't enjoy. I just needed you to understand that someone is always watching, always knowing. You're going to go home tonight, hug Amy, and not tell her about this. You're going to fix your truck, come back to work, and pretend this never happened. Because if you don't... He didn't finish the sentence, just removed his hand from the window, leaving a perfect handprint in the condensation. Then he turned and walked back into the cemetery, disappearing into the rain and darkness between the headstones. My truck started on the next try, as if nothing had been wrong with it at all. I drove home in a daze, stopped at the gas station out of some bizarre compulsion to see if he was right, and bought that scratch-off. $20 winner. At home, Amy had indeed made lasagna, and I hugged her so tight she asked if everything was okay. I told her it had just been a long day. That was 8 months ago. I still work at the cemetery, still close up most nights. I've never seen the man again, but sometimes I find things. A flower placed on a grave I just cleaned, footprints in areas I just raked, little signs that someone has been there. I looked through all our records, checked security footage from nearby businesses, even hired a private investigator with my savings. Nothing. No explanation. All I know is that somewhere out there, someone knows every detail of my life, and I'll never understand why they chose that night to let me know it. Last summer changed everything for me. I was 17, living in a small college town in Iowa with my parents and younger sister. Life was predictable. Summer job at the hardware store, hanging out at the mall, sneaking beers at house parties when someone's parents were out of town. I had this tight group of friends I'd known since middle school. There was Jason, who was obsessed with his YouTube channel where he posted urban exploration videos that maybe got 50 views each. Courtney, who drove us everywhere in her beat-up Ford Explorer, and Lucas, the quiet one who went along with whatever we planned. That particular night in early August, Jason had been begging us for weeks to help him film something actually interesting for his channel. He'd found this old cemetery on the outskirts of town, Fairview Memorial, that dated back to the 1800s. The place had been mostly forgotten, surrounded by cornfields and accessible only by a dirt road that the county barely maintained anymore. The four of us met up around 11 that night at the 24-hour gas station near the interstate. Jason had his camera equipment. Nothing fancy, just his phone with a stabilizer and a GoPro he'd gotten for Christmas. Courtney picked us up, and we drove out there with the windows down, listening to music and joking about how Jason was going to become YouTube famous from filming some old graves. The cemetery gates were chained shut, but there was a gap in the fence about 50 yards down where the wire had been cut and rolled back, probably by other kids who'd had the same brilliant idea. We squeezed through one by one, Jason filming the whole time, narrating in this fake dramatic voice about entering the realm of the dead, while we laughed and told him to shut up. The moon was almost full that night, bright enough that we could see the rows of weathered headstones stretching out across maybe 3 or 4 acres. Some were so old, the names had worn away completely, just smooth stone rectangles sticking up from the overgrown grass. We spent about an hour wandering around, being idiots basically. Lucas found this massive oak tree in the center, with roots that had pushed up through several graves, creating these weird bumps and valleys in the ground. Jason was getting footage of everything. The crumbling angel statues, the family plots with those little iron fences around them, this one headstone from 1847 that just said baby girl with no other information. Courtney kept reading the inscriptions out loud in different voices, making up stories about how each person died. "Here lies Ezekiel Thompson," she'd say in this old-timey accent, "choked on a chicken bone at Sunday dinner." We were trying to keep quiet since there were houses maybe a quarter mile away, but we kept cracking up at stupid stuff. At one point, Lucas pretended to rise from behind a headstone like a zombie, and Jason nearly dropped his phone trying to film it while laughing. The whole thing felt like any other night we'd spent together that summer, just messing around, killing time. Jason decided he needed some solo shots for his video intro, so he had me hold the GoPro while he walked between the graves doing his narrator thing. That's when things started to feel different, though I didn't really notice it at the time. While I was filming Jason, Courtney and Lucas had wandered off toward the back section where the older graves were. The cemetery sloped down there into a little valley where the grass grew thicker, and the headstones were mostly those thin slate ones that lean at weird angles. Jason was about 20 feet away from me, walking backwards while talking to the camera. When Courtney called out that she'd found something cool, we jogged over to where they were standing around this old mausoleum built into the hillside. The thing was maybe 12 feet wide, made of limestone blocks that had turned gray and streaky from weather. The metal door was slightly open, just a few inches, and you could see the rusty chain that was supposed to keep it shut had been broken for who knows how long. Jason immediately wanted to film inside, but even he wasn't dumb enough to actually go in there. The gap in the door was just wide enough to stick the phone through, so that's what he did, using the flashlight to record whatever was in there. We all crowded around the little screen to watch. It was mostly empty, just stone shelves on the walls where coffins would have been placed, some old leaves blown into the corners, and what looked like beer cans from other people who'd been there before us. While Jason was filming, I remember Lucas kept looking around, not nervous exactly, but the way you do when you're waiting for someone. He asked if we heard that, and we all stopped talking to listen. It was just crickets and wind through the corn in the nearby fields. Courtney made fun of him for being paranoid, but I noticed she stayed closer to the group after that. We decided to head toward the front section again, where the newer graves were and where we'd have better light from the street lamps on the main road. The last 20 minutes we were there, Jason had us do this stupid thing where we'd each stand by a different headstone while he panned the camera across, like some artsy shot for his video. I was leaning against this tall obelisk-style monument for some family called the Washburns, trying not to laugh, while Jason directed us like he was filming a real movie. Courtney was maybe 30 feet to my left, sitting on the base of a big cross, and Lucas was further out, standing by the fence. Jason walked backwards slowly, keeping us all in frame with his phone, narrating some nonsense about the living among the dead or whatever. That's the footage I can't stop thinking about now. While Jason was filming that wide shot, moving the camera from left to right across all three of us, he captured something else. Behind me, behind Courtney, even behind Lucas at different points. We didn't see anything that night, I swear we didn't. But the camera did. We left around 12:30, squeezing back through the fence and piling into Courtney's Explorer. The ride home was typical. Jason reviewing his footage in the passenger seat, already talking about editing and what music he'd use, while Lucas and I sat in the back making jokes about how we'd probably all get haunted now. Courtney dropped me off last since I lived furthest from downtown. I remember walking up my driveway, seeing my parents' bedroom window was dark, relieved I'd made it home without getting caught. The next day was Saturday, and I worked a morning shift at the hardware store, sold some paint and lumber to contractors, normal stuff. Jason texted our group chat around noon saying he'd started editing the video and it was looking sick. I didn't think about the cemetery again until Sunday evening when Jason called me directly, which was weird because he usually just texted. His voice sounded different, kind of flat and confused. He asked if I could come over right away, said he needed to show me something about the footage. I drove over to Jason's house around 7. His parents were at some dinner thing, and I found him in his room with his laptop open, the editing software paused on a frame from Friday night. Lucas was already there, sitting on the bed looking uncomfortable. Jason didn't say anything at first, just hit play on a clip. It was the footage from when we first entered through the fence, all four of us squeezing through and laughing. But there, maybe 15 feet behind us in the frame, barely visible between two headstones, was a person, just standing there, watching us come in. The figure was wearing something dark, maybe a jacket or coat, and they were perfectly still. Jason rewound it, played it again. The person was definitely there, positioned in a way where they could see us but we couldn't see them. "Keep watching," Jason said, and clicked to another clip. This one was from when I was filming him doing his narrator walk. In the background, moving between the graves parallel to Jason but staying behind the larger monuments, was the same figure. Jason had gone through all the footage from that night, both his phone and the GoPro, and found the person in at least 12 different clips. Never in the foreground, never obvious, but always there. When we were at the mausoleum, they were crouched behind a cluster of headstones about 40 feet away. When Jason was filming us doing that final wide shot, the figure appeared behind each of us at different times, ducking down whenever Jason's camera moved in their direction. The worst part was this one clip where Courtney and Lucas had wandered off to the old section. While I was holding the GoPro and talking to Jason, you could see the figure in the background, much closer than in the other clips, maybe only 10 feet behind me. They were standing next to this tall memorial, and for about 3 seconds, you could make out more details. It looked like a man, middle-aged maybe, wearing a dark windbreaker and jeans. His face was partially visible, and he was staring directly at me, not at Jason, who was doing all the talking, but at me specifically. Jason zoomed in as much as he could, but the image got too pixelated to make out facial features clearly. We called Courtney immediately and told her to come over. While we waited, the three of us went through the footage frame by frame, and it got worse. The person knew where our cameras were pointed at all times. They moved when we moved, stopped when we stopped, always maintaining these perfect positions to stay hidden from our direct view but visible to the camera. In one shot where Lucas was pretending to be a zombie, rising up from behind a headstone, you could see the figure had moved to a spot right behind where Lucas had been crouching just seconds before. If Lucas had looked back before standing up, they would have been face to face. Courtney arrived and went pale when we showed her everything. She pointed out something we'd missed. In the clip where she was reading the funny inscriptions, there was a moment where she'd spun around quickly because she thought Lucas was behind her trying to scare her. But Lucas was actually 20 feet away looking at other graves. In the footage, you could see why she'd turned. The figure had been approaching her from behind and had just ducked behind a headstone when she started to turn. We spent the next hour trying to figure out what to do. Lucas wanted to call the police, but what would we say? That someone was in a public cemetery at the same time we were trespassing there. Jason was freaking out about whether to delete everything or save it as evidence of something. Courtney kept going back to one particular clip, the last one Jason had filmed as we were leaving. Showed us walking toward the fence gap, and the figure was following us, staying about 30 feet back, stopping behind monuments whenever one of us glanced around. But right before the video cut off, just as Jason lowered his phone, the figure had started moving faster, like they were going to follow us through the fence. That's when Courtney remembered something that made everything worse. When we'd gotten back to her Explorer that night, she'd had to adjust her rearview mirror because someone had bumped it. We'd assumed Lucas had hit it getting into the back seat, but Lucas had gotten in on the other side. Someone had been close enough to our car to touch it, maybe looking inside, maybe trying the doors. We'd driven away completely unaware that this person might have been right there in the parking area with us. The four of us agreed not to post anything online and to tell our parents if anything else weird happened. For about a week, nothing did. Then Courtney found something that still makes me sick to think about. She'd been cleaning out her Explorer and found a receipt under the passenger seat that wasn't hers. It was from a gas station dated the night we'd gone to the cemetery, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m., while we were still there. The receipt was for a coffee and a disposable phone charger. But here's the thing that really got us. The gas station was the same one where we'd met up that night. Someone had been there when we were, had probably watched us leave, maybe even followed us to the cemetery. We went back to Jason's footage from when he'd filmed us arriving at Fairview, and there it was, a pair of headlights way back on the dirt road, turning off right after we'd parked. We'd thought it was just someone using the road to turn around. Now we knew better. We never found out who it was or what they wanted. We filed a police report eventually, but nothing came of it. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, following other groups of kids with their cameras, staying just out of sight, waiting for, I don't even know what. The July heat in 2016 was brutal in our small Montana town, the kind that made the asphalt bubble and the air shimmer like water. I was 17, spending most of my days at my buddy Connor's place because his parents had central air and mine didn't. We'd been friends since middle school, both of us outcasts who bonded over skateboarding and trying to find anything interesting to do in a place where the most exciting event was the annual corn festival. Connor had this wild red hair that stuck up no matter how much gel he used, and freckles that covered every inch of his pale skin. That particular Thursday, we were sprawled on his basement floor, scrolling through our phones, when Connor suddenly sat up with that look in his eyes that always meant trouble. "Dude, you know that old Greenwood cemetery off Route 84? The one with the abandoned funeral home next to it?" he said, showing me some urban exploration forum on his phone where people were posting photos of the place. I knew exactly which cemetery he meant. Everyone in town did, though most people drove past it without a second glance. The place had been partially operational until about 5 years before, when the funeral home shut down after some financial scandal with the owner. Now the cemetery only did burials for people who already had family plots there, maybe 1 or 2 funerals a year max. The funeral home itself, a massive Victorian-style building with peeling white paint and broken shutters, sat right at the edge of the property like some kind of guard tower. Connor was already pulling up more photos on his phone, showing me shots of elaborate old headstones and mausoleums that looked like tiny churches. "We should check it out tonight," he said. And even though every rational part of my brain said it was a terrible idea, the boredom was crushing enough that I heard myself saying yes. We made plans to meet at midnight, telling our parents we were sleeping at each other's houses. The oldest trick in the book, but it always worked because both sets of parents trusted us not to do anything too stupid. Around 11:45 that night, I slipped out through my bedroom window and jogged the 8 blocks to Connor's house, where he was already waiting by the curb with his dad's flashlight and a backpack full of snacks like we were going on some kind of camping trip. The walk to the cemetery took about 40 minutes, following the main road until it turned into the older highway that led out of town. There were no streetlights once we passed the last subdivision, just the occasional car heading who knows where at that hour. The temperature had dropped to something bearable, probably mid-70s, and crickets were going absolutely crazy in the fields on either side of us. Connor kept talking the whole way, nervous energy making him ramble about random stuff. His sister's new boyfriend, some game he wanted to buy, whether we thought Mr. Peterson would fail him in chemistry. But when we finally saw the cemetery gates appearing in the darkness, both of us went quiet. The main entrance had been chained shut, but the fence along the side was only about 4 feet high, decorative iron with spikes on top that looked intimidating, but were spaced far enough apart that we could easily climb over between them. The cemetery itself was bigger than it looked from the road, stretching back into darkness with rows and rows of headstones in various states of decay. Some sections were well maintained, with fresh flowers and neatly trimmed grass, while others had been completely overtaken by weeds and wildflowers that reached up to our waists. Connor immediately started taking pictures with his phone, the flash lighting up names and dates from the 1800s, elaborate carved angels and crosses that probably cost more than my parents' car when they were made. We stuck to the main path at first, gravel crunching under our sneakers, but then Connor spotted the funeral home looming against the sky and started heading straight for it. The building was even creepier up close, 3 stories tall with a wraparound porch that had partially collapsed on one side. Most of the windows were boarded up, but a few on the ground floor had been broken, leaving dark holes that seemed to swallow the beam of Connor's flashlight when he shined it through. "Holy shit, look at this," he whispered, pointing to a side door that was hanging open, barely attached to its hinges. The smell hit us before we even got close. Mildew, rot, and something chemical underneath, like old formaldehyde maybe. We were debating whether to actually go inside when we heard it. Footsteps on gravel coming from somewhere behind the building. Not running, just walking steady and deliberate, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. Connor grabbed my arm and we ducked behind a large headstone, both of us trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The footsteps got closer, and then we saw him. A man, probably in his 50s or 60s, wearing dark work clothes and carrying what looked like a camping lantern that wasn't lit. He had thinning gray hair that hung down to his shoulders and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. But what really got me was how he moved through the cemetery, not using any light, navigating between the headstones like he'd walked this path 1,000 times before. He went straight to the funeral home's side door, the one we'd just been looking at, and disappeared inside. Connor and I stayed frozen behind that headstone for what felt like forever but was probably only a minute or two, waiting to see if he'd come back out. When he didn't, Connor whispered that we should leave, but then we saw a light flicker on in one of the second-floor windows, a warm orange glow like from a lantern or candle. Curiosity won out over common sense, and we crept closer to the building, staying in the shadows of the larger monuments. Through one of the broken first-floor windows, we could hear the man moving around upstairs, footsteps creaking on old floorboards, and what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. Then we heard something that made us both stop breathing. Another voice, younger, maybe our age or a little older, saying something we couldn't quite make out. The older man's voice responded, louder and aggressive, almost angry. "I told you to wait in the room. You don't go anywhere unless I say so." There was more movement, faster now, and the younger voice again, this time clearly distressed, almost pleading. Connor was already backing away, pulling at my shirt, but I couldn't move. The man's voice got louder. "You wanted to see real history, didn't you? You wanted the full experience. This is what you asked for." A door slammed somewhere inside, hard enough that we could hear it echo through the empty building. That broke whatever spell had me rooted in place, and Connor and I ran, not caring anymore about being quiet, just needing to get away from that building and whatever was happening inside it. We didn't stop running until we hit the main road, both of us doubled over and gasping for air. Connor's face was pale even in the darkness, and he kept looking back toward the cemetery like he expected that man to come chasing after us. "We need to call the cops," he kept saying, but with what phone? We were two teenagers who'd broken into a cemetery at night. Who was going to believe us? Plus, we didn't even know for sure what we'd witnessed. Maybe it was just some homeless guy yelling at another homeless guy. Maybe they were urban explorers like us, and the older one was just pissed about something. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew something was deeply wrong about what we'd heard. The way that younger voice had sounded, the aggression in the man's tone, the mention of showing someone real history. None of it sat right. We walked back to town in complete silence, both of us jumping at every car that passed, every shadow that moved. When we finally made it to Connor's house around 2 a.m., we sat on his front steps for another hour, trying to decide what to do. Eventually, we agreed to sleep on it and figure it out in the morning, but I don't think either of us actually slept that night. The next day, Connor called me around noon, his voice shaking. "Dude, you need to see this," he said. "Come over right now." When I got to his house, he had his laptop open to a local news site. The headline made me feel like I'd swallowed ice. "Police searching for missing college student last seen in Granite Falls area." The article was about a 19-year-old named Wesley Huang from the State University, who'd told his roommate he was going to explore some abandoned buildings for his photography class and never came back. That was 3 days ago. Connor had already opened 5 other tabs, all missing persons cases from the last 2 years, all young people between 16 and 21, all last seen in or around our town. But what really got us was the Facebook post Connor found from a community group, dated 6 months earlier. A woman named Sharon Vance had written this long, angry post about a man who'd approached her teenage son at the skate park, talking about the fascinating history of the old cemetery and funeral home, offering to give him a private tour at night when the real atmosphere could be experienced. She'd included a photo from her doorbell camera of the man when he'd apparently come to her house looking for her son after he'd declined. Gray shoulder-length hair, unkempt beard, probably late 50s. It was definitely the same man we'd seen. Connor's hands were literally trembling as he scrolled through more posts in the community group. There were at least 7 different people over the past year warning about a man matching that exact description, hanging around places where teenagers gathered. The skate park, the mall parking lot, the 24-hour diner on Route 84. He always had the same approach, talking about local history, especially the cemetery and funeral home, offering to show people things the public doesn't get to see. One father, James Novak, had commented that he'd filed a police report after the man had approached his daughter Kelsey and her friends at a gas station, but the cops said they couldn't do anything since he hadn't technically committed a crime. The man had given Kelsey a name, Richard Toomey, and said he was a local historian writing a book about funeral practices in rural America. But when Mr. Novak searched that name, he found something disturbing. A Richard Toomey from Illinois who'd served 8 years for kidnapping and false imprisonment back in 2003. The photos from the conviction were old and grainy, but the face structure was similar enough. The guy had been released in 2011 and apparently dropped off the radar until these posts started appearing. We spent the next 2 hours going down a rabbit hole of information, and every new detail made things worse. Connor found an archived news article from 2015 about the funeral home. Apparently, it had been broken into multiple times after closing, with reports of squatters and evidence of people staying there for extended periods. The police had supposedly sealed it up, but obviously that hadn't worked. Then I remembered something that made me physically sick. The younger voice we'd heard had sounded distressed but not surprised, like they'd been there for a while already. Wesley Huang had been missing for 3 days. What if he'd been in that building the whole time? Connor was already dialing 911, but I stopped him. We needed to think about this carefully. If we called in an anonymous tip, they might not take it seriously. If we gave our names, we'd have to admit to trespassing, and our parents would lose their minds. But then Connor pulled up Wesley's Facebook page, and seeing his face, just a normal kid with a bright smile wearing a university hoodie, arms around friends at some party, made the decision for us. Connor called the police, putting on his most adult voice, and told them he'd seen suspicious activity at the old Greenwood Cemetery, specifically someone going in and out of the abandoned funeral home at night, and that it might be connected to the missing college student. The dispatcher asked a bunch of questions that Connor tried to answer, without giving away too much about why we'd been there. He said we'd been driving past, even though neither of us could legally drive yet, and saw lights in a building that was supposed to be abandoned. She said they'd send someone to check it out and took Connor's phone number, though he gave her a fake name. Probably stupid, but we were panicking. We spent the rest of the afternoon refreshing the news sites and the police department's Facebook page, waiting for any update. Around 6 p.m. it came. Police activity at Greenwood Cemetery, area closed to public. Then, an hour later, the update that made us both nearly throw up. Missing university student found alive, suspect in custody. They didn't release many details that night, but the next morning, the full story broke. Richard Toomey, 62, had been arrested and charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and assault. He'd been living in the funeral home's basement for months, had set up a makeshift living space with a generator for power, and had been luring young people there with promises of historical tours and ghost hunting experiences. Wesley had been held in an old embalming room for 3 days, and there was evidence suggesting he wasn't the first. The news reports over the following weeks revealed the full scope of what had been happening. Toomey had been approaching teenagers and college students for over 18 months, though Wesley was the first one they could prove he'd actually kidnapped. The others had either gotten away when things felt wrong or had been released after shorter periods for reasons that weren't made public. The prosecutor said Toomey had an obsession with what he called teaching real history through experience, which apparently meant trapping kids in that funeral home and subjecting them to bizarre lectures about death, burial practices, and his own twisted philosophy about understanding mortality. Wesley testified that Toomey would keep him locked in different rooms, forcing him to listen to hours-long rambling monologues about embalming techniques, showing him old funeral equipment, making him lie in coffins. It was psychological torture disguised as education. Connor and I never told anyone we were there that night, and honestly, the guilt of not going inside to help still eats at me sometimes. But the police said Wesley was rescued within hours of our call, and that's what matters. Toomey got 25 years, and the funeral home was demolished last year. I still drive past that cemetery sometimes, and every single time I think about that young voice we heard and wonder how many others there might have been who were too scared or ashamed to come forward. Wesley's doing okay now, from what I've heard. He transferred to a different school and is studying to become a social worker, wanting to help other trauma survivors. As for Connor and me, we never went urban exploring again, and we definitely never talked about that night without both of us ending up unable to sleep for days afterward. I was in my second year of college when this happened, majoring in visual arts and trying to put together a photography series for one of my studio classes. At the time, I didn't have much of a social life. I was the kind of person who'd rather spend hours fiddling with camera settings than go to parties. My professor had given us complete freedom to choose a theme, and I thought photographing old cemeteries would capture the mood I wanted. Quiet, forgotten places where time seemed to pause. The one I picked wasn't far from campus, a small-town cemetery surrounded by tall iron fencing and a scattering of oaks that leaned as if they were tired from holding centuries of history. That afternoon, the weather was perfect for the look I wanted. The sky was gray enough to soften the light, and there was a cool wind that kept the air restless. I set up near a row of crooked headstones, adjusting the lens to get the texture of the stone and the way moss clung to the carvings. My bag was on the ground beside me, full of extra lenses and a cheap thermos of coffee. Everything felt normal, just another quiet day spent in my own little world with the camera as company. I didn't notice anyone else around, at least not at first. I snapped dozens of photos before taking a break to review them on the tiny screen. Most of them looked how I hoped: muted tones, sharp details, eerie atmosphere. But when I zoomed into one frame, my breath caught for a second. In the far left corner, almost blending into the background, stood a man. He wasn't near the headstones I had been focused on. He was further back, under one of the trees. His posture was strange, too upright, too deliberate. I couldn't make out his face because of the shadows, but the outline was clear enough. I glanced up from the camera, half expecting to see him still standing there, but the space under the tree was empty. I told myself I must have captured someone passing by without noticing. Maybe another student with the same idea, or a local cutting through the grounds. I shook it off and kept working, crouching lower to get different angles. But the thought of that figure stayed in the back of my mind, nagging like a word I couldn't quite remember. When I checked the next batch of shots, my chest tightened again. The man was there once more, this time not beneath the tree but closer, standing near a cracked monument that leaned sideways. He was still in the background, but his position had shifted in a way that felt deliberate, like he wanted to be noticed only after I'd looked back at the photos. The strangest part was how consistent his figure looked from one frame to the next, as if he hadn't moved naturally, but had just appeared in a new spot. I scanned the grounds more carefully, walking a few steps to each side, but the place was silent. The cemetery was big enough that someone could disappear behind the mausoleums or stone walls, yet the stillness around me didn't match the idea of a person wandering nearby. The only sounds were my own footsteps crunching dead leaves and the faint creak of branches rubbing together. I called out a quick hello, even though I wasn't sure why, maybe to reassure myself that whoever it was would answer. No one did. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to admit I was spooked. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe my lens catching a shadow in a way that looked human. So I kept going, forcing myself to focus on the project. I took wide shots of the older section where the stones were eroded into barely legible shapes. When I looked at those pictures, though, my stomach tightened. The figure was back, and this time I could see more detail. He wore a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather, and his outline was sharper, closer, like he had stepped forward between frames. I snapped the camera shut and looked around again, faster this time. The rows of stones stretched in every direction. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but there was no one standing where the image said he should be. My pulse quickened, and the idea of it being a shadow stopped making sense. Shadows don't get closer on their own. It felt less like coincidence and more like some kind of interaction, like the photos were showing me something I wasn't supposed to see with my own eyes. I moved to a different section of the cemetery, partly to prove to myself that this was nothing unusual. I aimed the camera at a small mausoleum, its door sealed shut with rusted hinges, and took a series of shots from different distances. When I looked back at the preview, my breath caught in my throat. He was there again, no longer at a distance but at the edge of the frame, angled slightly toward me. The image gave the impression that he was aware of me, aware of the lens, and waiting for me to notice him. This time I didn't waste energy calling out. I scanned every corner of the cemetery with wide, frantic sweeps, but it was the same empty landscape. It was like the camera had access to something I couldn't see in real time. My hands gripped the equipment tighter than I meant to, and I shoved it all into my bag without caring about scratches or proper storage. The quiet that had once felt artistic now pressed down on me in a way that made my chest ache. I walked quickly to the gate, resisting the urge to run because I didn't want to hear the sound of running footsteps that weren't mine. When I reached the car, I locked the doors before even starting the engine. The drive back to campus blurred together, my eyes darting constantly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to catch the man's coat or his shape tucked into the shadows of the back seat. Of course, there was nothing there. Later that night, I pulled the SD card from my camera and loaded the pictures onto my laptop. I thought maybe I'd convince myself it had been a trick, some stranger wandering that I failed to spot in the moment. But as the images filled the screen, it became impossible to explain away. In each sequence, he moved closer, always toward me, until the last photo where the entire frame was filled with dark fabric and the faint outline of a collar. No face, just the suggestion of him right at the lens. I deleted every file and I never went back to that cemetery. To this day, I don't know if I captured someone real or something I was never supposed to bring back with me.